February 17, 1944. Dawn broke cold over the Pacific, painting the ocean in shades of steel and smoke. 40 miles northwest of Truk Atoll, the Japanese training cruiser Katori limped through calm seas, her engines straining, her crew exhausted. Escorting her were the destroyers Mikes and Nowaki, along with the armed merchant cruiser Akagi Maru and a small minesweeping trawler. They were running for Yokosuka, desperate to escape what had become a slaughterhouse. Behind them, Truk burned. American carrier aircraft had turned Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific into an inferno of twisted steel and billowing black smoke. 250 aircraft destroyed. 30 ships sunk. The once-impregnable fortress reduced to rubble in less than 24 hours. But the men aboard Katori didn't know that the worst was yet to come. They couldn't know that racing toward them across the horizon were two ships that would rewrite everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about naval warfare. At 0630, a lookout on Katori's bridge spotted something troubling. Masts. Multiple masts, closing fast from the east. Within minutes, the silhouettes resolved into unmistakable shapes, two massive battleships, their hulls cutting through the water at impossible speed, throwing bow waves like mountains of white foam. These weren't the slow, ponderous dreadnoughts Japan had trained to fight. These were predators, sleek and fast, their superstructures bristling with radar antennas that looked like alien eyes scanning the ocean. Captain Tamakio Oda raised his binoculars. His hands didn't shake, he was too experienced for that, but his mind raced through calculations that made no sense. American battleships. Here. Moving at what appeared to be over 30 knots. That was destroyer speed. Battleships didn't move like that. Battleships were slow, armored fortresses that traded mobility for protection. Yet here were two behemoths, each longer than 2.5 football fields, moving like greyhounds across the Pacific. What Captain Oda couldn't see, what no optical rangefinder could reveal at this distance, were the guns. 9 16-inch Mark 7 naval rifles. 50 calibers long. Each barrel weighing as much as a locomotive. Each shell capable of traveling over 20 miles. And behind those guns, something far more terrifying than steel and explosives, a fire control system so advanced it turned mathematics into death with mechanical precision. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese Navy had built its doctrine on a foundation of courage, tradition, and the samurai spirit of Bushido. Their officers trained for years in the art of visual gunnery, learning to estimate range by eye, to calculate lead times through instinct and experience. They believed that steel, properly wielded by disciplined men, could overcome any technological advantage. They believed that battles were won through superior training, tactical brilliance, and the unbreakable will of the warrior. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. Aboard the USS Iowa, leading Battleship Division 7, the mood was clinical. Captain John McCrae stood on the bridge, his eyes moving between radar displays and the distant horizon. Beside him, Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Task Group 50.9 with the calm precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. There was no bravado, no battle cries. Just the quiet hum of machinery and the steady flow of information from the ship's electronic nerve center. In the plotting room deep within Iowa's armored citadel, fire control officers hunched over the Mark 8 Rangekeeper, a massive analog computer that weighed as much as a small car. Gears spun, servo motors adjusted, gyroscopes maintained perfect balance despite the ship's movement through the water. Data flowed in from multiple sources, radar range and bearing, wind speed and direction measured by anemometers, ship's speed and course from the gyrocompass, even the temperature and humidity that would affect shell trajectory. The Mark 8 radar had detected Katori at 38,000 yards, over 21 miles. At that distance, the Japanese cruiser was invisible to the naked eye, hidden beyond the curvature of the Earth itself. But to Iowa's radar, she was crystal clear, a blip on the oscilloscope screen that might as well have been painted with a targeting crosshair. Lieutenant Harold Kent, Iowa's fire control officer, made final adjustments to the firing solution. A former mathematics teacher from Ohio, Kent had spent the last year mastering the intricacies of the Mark III-8 director and its associated computing systems. He understood that what they were about to attempt wasn't just gunnery, it was applied physics on a scale that would have amazed the engineers who'd designed these weapons only a few years earlier. Solution set, Kent reported, his voice steady. Range 35,000 yards. Target bearing 320 degrees. Wind 5 knots from the northeast. Target speed estimated 22 knots. Captain McRae nodded once. All batteries, he said quietly. Stand by for full salvo. Below decks, in the 3 massive gun turrets that gave Iowa her killing power, crews moved through practiced routines. In Turret 2, 94 men worked in a space that extended 5 decks down into the ship's vitals. Powder bags, each weighing 90 pounds, rode conveyor belts up from the magazines. Shells, 2,700 pounds of steel and high explosive, were hoisted from the shell rooms and loaded with mechanical precision into bridges designed to withstand pressures that would crush ordinary steel. The gunners' mates had learned to work with their mouths slightly open, a technique to prevent ruptured eardrums when the guns fired. The sound of a 16-inch gun wasn't just loud, it was a physical force that compressed the air itself, that could stop a man's heart if he stood too close without protection. In the fire control tower, radar operators watched as the range closed. 34,000 yards. 33,000. The Iowa's advanced fire control system continuously recalculated the firing solution, adjusting for the changing distance, the slight variations in wind, the precise angle needed to account for the Earth's rotation during the shell's flight time of nearly a minute. This was the revolution that Japan's admirals couldn't understand, because they'd never seen anything like it. The Iowa-class battleships weren't just ships with big guns. They were floating fire control computers wrapped in armor, capable of delivering devastating firepower at ranges that made traditional naval combat obsolete. The Japanese had built the Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, with 18-inch guns and armor so thick it seemed impenetrable. They'd invested their faith in size, in raw tonnage, in the belief that bigger was always better. But the Americans had taken a different path. They'd married industrial precision to electronic innovation, creating weapon systems that didn't just fire shells, they delivered mathematical certainty. On the bridge of Katori, Captain Oda made his decision. He would not run. Japanese naval officers did not flee. He ordered his ship to battle stations, knowing that his thin-hulled training cruisers stood no chance against American battleships, but determined to die with honor if that was his fate. What he couldn't realize, was that honor had nothing to do with what was about to happen. The Americans weren't coming to duel. They were coming to execute. At 0700 hours, with Katori now at 33,000 yards, Admiral Spruance gave the order that would echo across naval history. Commence firing. The morning exploded. 9 16-inch guns roared as one, hurling 24,300 pounds of steel and explosives into the sky. The blast was apocalyptic. Orange flame erupted from each barrel, reaching out 50 feet from the muzzles. The concussion flattened the sea around Iowa's bow, creating shock waves that could be felt on ships miles away. The entire 57,000-ton hull shuddered backward, absorbing the recoil through massive hydraulic systems designed for precisely this punishment. On nearby destroyers, sailors would later describe it as standing inside a thunderclap, as watching God himself punch the ocean. The shells climbed. Higher than Mount Everest. Faster than sound. Each one following a ballistic arc calculated by machines, adjusted for wind drift, compensated for the Coriolis effect caused by the planet's rotation. They were invisible to anyone watching from below, just mathematical certainties hurtling through the stratosphere. 43 seconds of flight time. 43 seconds during which Japanese lookouts on Katori stared at the horizon, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, unaware that death was falling toward them from the stratosphere. Then the ocean around Katori erupted in towers of white water. 8 massive geysers, each taller than the cruiser's mast, rose around the ship as 16-inch shells struck the sea. The noise arrived a split second later, rolling across the water like sustained thunder, deep and primal and utterly terrifying. Iowa's first salvo was a straddle, shells landing both long and short of the target, the gunner's dream that meant the aim was perfect and hits would follow. On Iowa's bridge, the spotter confirmed what the radar already knew. Straddle on target. No change needed. Captain Oda stared in disbelief at the columns of water collapsing around his ship. No aircraft. No torpedo wakes. Just enormous explosions appearing as if conjured from nowhere. The sound reached them seconds later, a rolling boom that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Where are they firing from?" his gunnery officer shouted, his voice cracking with something that might have been fear or might have been rage. Oda raised his binoculars again, scanning the horizon. There, barely visible against the morning light, two dark shapes, so far away they looked like toys on a distant shelf. At this range, Katori's own guns were useless. Her maximum effective range was perhaps 15,000 yards, and these American ships were engaging from more than twice that distance. "Impossible," his gunnery officer whispered. "No ship can fire accurately from that far. It's impossible." But the evidence was there in the water, in the massive craters left by shells that displaced thousands of tons of seawater. The Americans weren't guessing. They weren't firing blindly. They were aiming with a precision that defied everything Japanese officers had been taught about naval gunnery. Aboard Iowa, the loading crew worked with mechanical efficiency. Each turret could fire every 30 seconds if pressed, though Captain McRae held to a more measured pace, allowing time for fire control adjustments between salvos. There was no rush. The target couldn't escape, couldn't even return fire. This wasn't a battle. It was target practice with a living, breathing ship. The second salvo fired at 0702. 9 more shells climbed toward the stratosphere, their trajectories calculated by machines that knew no fear, no fatigue, no doubt. The Mark 8 rangekeeper had made thousands of calculations per second, integrating data from dozens of sensors, producing a firing solution of stunning accuracy. This time, the shells didn't miss. The first impact struck Katori just aft of the bridge, penetrating 3 decks before detonating in the ship's engineering spaces. The explosion was catastrophic. A 16-inch high-capacity shell contained hundreds of pounds of high explosive, designed to destroy everything within a 100-foot radius. When it detonated inside Katori's hull, it was like setting off a bomb in a tin can. Steel buckled and tore. Bulkheads vaporized. The blast wave ripped through passageways, killing dozens of men instantly, tossing others like ragdolls against machinery and walls. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition stores caught fire, as fuel lines ruptured and ignited. A second shell hit forward, near the bow, blowing a hole 20 feet across through the ship's side. Seawater rushed in with the force of a tidal wave, flooding compartments faster than damage control teams could seal bulkheads, if those bulkheads hadn't already been warped by the explosions. Captain Oda felt his ship list to port, felt the deck tilt beneath his boots. Smoke boiled from ventilation shafts. Somewhere below, men were screaming, trapped in spaces rapidly filling with water or burning from ruptured fuel lines. "Damage report," he shouted, but no answer came. The communication lines were dead, caught by explosions or shorted by flooding. He grabbed a speaking tube, the backup system, and shouted into it. Nothing. The ship was dying, and he was blind to how fast. On the horizon, barely visible through the smoke and spray, the American battleships continued their approach. They hadn't slowed. They showed no intention of stopping. They were closing for the kill with the methodical efficiency of machines. The destroyer Mikes maneuvered desperately alongside the dying Katori, her captain torn between duty and survival instinct. Commander Ishikawa knew his orders: protect the cruiser, engage the enemy, buy time for other ships to escape. He also knew that his destroyer, displacing barely 2,000 tons, was utterly outmatched by ships 30 times her size. But Japanese naval doctrine didn't allow for retreat. Not while a superior officer still flew his flag. Not while there was breath in their bodies. So Mikes charged, her engines screaming to full power, her torpedo tubes swinging toward the approaching American giants. At 0715, Masts launched a full spread of 8 Type 93 long lance torpedoes. These were the best torpedoes in the world, oxygen-fueled, nearly weightless, capable of running 24 miles at 48 knots. They were Japan's equalizer, the weapon that had sunk so many Allied ships in the dark waters of the South Pacific. Against most targets, they would have been devastating. Against the Iowa-class battleships, they were merely brave. Iowa's radar operators tracked the torpedo launch instantly. Multiple torpedo tracks, the radar officer called out calmly. Bearing 295 degrees, range 31,000 yards. Captain McRae didn't flinch. He'd seen the intelligence reports, knew that Japanese torpedoes were formidable weapons. But he also knew his ship. Iowa could turn 33 knots when pressed, could maneuver with an agility that defied her massive size. And with radar giving them early warning, evasion was straightforward mathematics. Right full rudder, McRae ordered. Maintain speed. The great ship heeled into her turn, her 4 enormous bronze propellers, each 17 feet in diameter, biting into the Pacific. 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers poured steam into 4 turbine sets, generating 212,000 horsepower, enough power to light a small city. Iowa carved through the turn like a racing yacht, not like a battleship that displaced nearly 60,000 tons. The torpedoes passed harmlessly astern, their weightless tracks detected and avoided before they could threaten the hull. Admiral Spruance, watching the torpedo tracks on radar, allowed himself the faintest smile. That would have been embarrassing, he remarked quietly. Masts' sacrifice had bought Katori perhaps 3 minutes. 3 minutes of continued flooding, continued fires, continued dying. On the cruiser's bridge, Captain Oda finally received a coherent damage report from a blood-soaked ensign who'd climbed 5 decks through smoke-filled passageways to reach him. Sir, we're flooding in 4 compartments. Engine room 3 is gone. All power to the aft section is lost. We have fire in the ammunition handling room. The pumps aren't working, sir. We can't stop the flooding. Oda stared at his ship's list, now approaching 15 degrees. He could feel Katori settling by the bow, could see the forward deck already awash. Around him, the bridge crew waited for orders that he couldn't give, orders that wouldn't matter. His ship was dead. The only question was how many of his men he could save. But before he could issue the abandon ship order, the horizon flashed orange again. Iowa's 3rd salvo arrived at 0718. This time, 3 shells found their mark in rapid succession. The first struck near the waterline amidships, punching through the thin armor belt as if it were paper and detonating inside the main machinery spaces. The explosion lifted the entire center of the ship, bending the keel, breaking Katori's back. The second shell hit the forward turret, silencing Katori's main armament before it could even train toward the enemy. The turret simply ceased to exist, replaced by a crater of torn metal and smoke. The third shell struck aft, near the stern, setting off a secondary explosion in a fuel bunker that sent a mushroom cloud of black smoke hundreds of feet into the air. Katori lurched violently to port. The list reached 20 degrees, then 25. Men on the upper decks began sliding toward the rail, grabbing anything bolted down to arrest their fall. Others jumped into the oil-slicked water rather than be trapped when the ship capsized. Captain Oda gripped the chart table, feeling his ship dying beneath him like a wounded animal. Around him, junior officers looked to him for guidance, for orders, for some semblance of control in the chaos. He wanted to tell them something profound, something that would be remembered, something worthy of the naval tradition they'd all sworn to uphold. Instead, he simply said, "Abandon ship. Get the men off. Now." The order passed by voice from man to man, shouted over the roar of fires and the groan of tortured steel. Sailors abandoned their posts, streaming toward the high side of the ship, toward life rafts and boats that were already being lowered into the churning water. Many didn't make it. When Katori's list passed 30 degrees, she went quickly, rolling onto her side like a dying whale, her hull gleaming wet in the morning light for just a moment before the Pacific claimed her. She sank stern first at 0745, disappearing beneath the waves in less than 2 minutes. From first contact to final sinking, 11 minutes had elapsed. 11 minutes in which a training cruiser that had served Japan's Navy for more than a decade was reduced to a spreading oil slick and scattered debris. Admiral Spruance watched through binoculars as the cruiser vanished. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Just a grim acknowledgement that modern war had become something cold and mechanical, a process where courage meant nothing against superior technology and industrial capacity. Target destroyed, the spotter confirmed. Survivors in the water. Shall we recover them? Spruance considered for a moment, then shook his head. We haven't time. Enemy aircraft could arrive at any moment. Signal the formation, destroy remaining escorts and proceed on course. It was a cold calculation, but war had become a cold business. There would be no rescue. The survivors of Katori, those who hadn't gone down with the ship, would have to swim for truck or hope that Japanese vessels could reach them before sharks or exposure claimed them. Most wouldn't make it. Maikaze was next. The destroyer had stood by the dying cruiser, launching her torpedoes, firing her 5-inch guns in futile defiance even though her shells fell miles short of their targets. Now, with Katori gone, she tried to run, her engines pushed beyond their rated capacity, black smoke pouring from her stacks. But she couldn't run from radar. Iowa's fire control systems tracked her every move, calculating her speed, predicting her course. At 0752, the heavy cruisers USS New Orleans and USS Minneapolis, which had been trailing the battleships, opened fire with their 8-inch guns. Maikaze died hard. For 12 minutes, she twisted and turned, trying to throw off American aim, her captain showing remarkable skill in handling his ship. But there was no escape. Shells from the cruisers bracketed her, then found her. 8-inch projectiles tore through her thin hull, detonating inside her machinery spaces, her bridge, her magazine. At 0804, a shell penetrated Maikaze's forward magazine. The resulting explosion broke the destroyer in half. Both sections sank within 30 seconds. There were no survivors. 2,000 tons of steel and 240 men simply ceased to exist, vaporized by explosions or dragged down by the suction of the sinking ship. That left Milwaukee. Commander Moriya Setsuji, her captain, was an experienced officer who'd survived battles from Midway to the Philippine Sea. He'd seen what happened to Katori and Maikaze. He knew that staying to fight meant death. And unlike his brother officers, he decided that living to fight another day was the better part of valor. At 0805, as Iowa and New Jersey turned their attention toward his ship, Milwaukee pushed her engines to emergency power and ran. 35 knots, maybe more, with black smoke pouring from her stacks and her hull vibrating from the strain. She ran directly away from the American battleships, weaving and zigzagging, making herself as difficult a target as possible. It almost worked. Almost. Iowa and New Jersey gave chase at 32.5 knots, the fastest battleships in the world pursuing a destroyer that had perhaps a 3-knot advantage. The range held steady at 35,000 yards, over 20 miles, as both sides pushed their engines to the limit. Then Iowa's gunnery officer proposed something audacious. "We can hit her," he told Captain McRae. "The radar lock is solid. Range is stable. If we fire under radar control, we can straddle her. Maybe get a hit." McRae looked at Admiral Spruance, who nodded slowly. This would be a test of American technology against Japanese seamanship, of radar-guided fire at ranges that would have been considered impossible just a few years earlier. "Load high-capacity shells," McRae ordered. "Commence firing when ready." The gun crews had been waiting for this. They'd watched Katori and Maikaze die from distances where the enemy couldn't even see them clearly. Now they would attempt something even more remarkable, hitting a fast-moving destroyer at maximum range, with radar as their eyes and mathematics as their guide. At 0815, Iowa fired her first salvo at Milwaukee. Range, 35,700 yards. Distance, 20.3 statute miles. The shells climbed even higher than before, their trajectory arcing into the stratosphere before plunging back toward the ocean. The flight time was 50 seconds. 50 seconds during which Milwaukee continued her desperate run, her captain ordering course changes every 20 seconds to throw off American aim. 50 seconds during which Iowa's fire control computers tracked her movement, predicted her position, adjusted the firing solution for the next salvo. The shells landed in a perfect straddle, 4 on Milwaukee's port side, 4 on her starboard, creating 8 massive water columns that bracketed the destroyer like the fingers of God reaching down from heaven. On Milwaukee's bridge, Commander Moriya stared in disbelief at the waterspouts collapsing around his ship. He'd zigzagged. He'd changed course. He was over 20 miles away, with the American ships barely visible on the horizon. And they'd straddled him. First salvo. At a range where visual gunnery would have been pure guesswork. Impossible, his gunnery officer breathed. They can't see us. They can't possibly see us. But they didn't need to see. That was the point. The Iowa-class battleships had transcended the limitations of human vision. They fought with machines that saw through darkness, through rain, through the curvature of the earth itself. They calculated trajectories with precision no human could match. They turned gunnery from an art into a science, from skill into mathematics. Moriya ordered another course change, more radical this time. Milwaukee heeled violently to port, her captain gambling that the Americans couldn't adjust their aim fast enough to compensate. Iowa's second salvo fired at 0817. The fire control computers had tracked Milwaukee's turn, had predicted her new heading, had adjusted elevation and bearing to compensate. 9 more shells climbed toward the stratosphere. This time, the salvo landed even closer. 2 shells passed within 50 yards of Milwaukee's stern. The shock waves from their impact compressed the water around the destroyer, creating pressure waves that buckled her thin plating. Splinters of steel, fragments from the shells that had detonated on contact with the water, peppered her superstructure, killing 2 sailors on the open bridge and shredding her radio antennas. Milwaukee shook like a terrier grabbed by a mastiff. Commander Moriya felt the deck tremble beneath his boots, heard the screams of wounded men, smelled the acrid stench of explosive propellant carried on the wind. One more hit. Just one solid hit from those monster shells, and Milwaukee would cease to exist. He ordered more smoke, more speed, more course changes. His engineers reported that the engines were operating beyond their design limits, that bearing temperatures were climbing into the danger zone, that they couldn't maintain this pace much longer. "Keep it up," Moriya shouted into the speaking tube. "Keep it up or we all die." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Iowa fired her third salvo at 0820. By now, the battleship's gun barrels were heating, their rifling expanding slightly from the repeated firing. The fire control officer compensated, adjusting the ballistic calculations to account for the changed bore. Conditions. The Mark 8 rangekeeper processed the new data, integrated it with the target's continued evasive maneuvers, and generated a firing solution. 9 shells arced across 21 miles of ocean. 52 seconds of flight time. 52 seconds during which Milwaukee twisted and turned like a slalom skier, her captain's seamanship the only thing keeping his ship alive. The shells landed close, terrifyingly close, but no direct hits. Water columns erupted around Milwaukee, drenching her decks, but the destroyer survived. Commander Moriya allowed himself the faintest hope. Maybe they could escape. Maybe the Americans couldn't maintain this accuracy forever. Maybe, if he could just stay ahead of those shells for another few minutes, they'd give up the chase and return to the carrier force. On Iowa's bridge, Captain McCrae consulted with his gunnery officer. They'd fired 3 salvos, 27 shells, at a single destroyer. They'd achieved remarkable accuracy at impossible ranges, but they hadn't sunk her. And ammunition wasn't infinite. More importantly, Admiral Spruance had a schedule to keep. The carrier task force needed its battleship screen back. One more salvo, McCrae decided. Then we break off. The 4th salvo fired at 0824. Iowa's gunners, frustrated at the destroyer's survival, poured their concentration into this final attempt. The fire control officer triple-checked his calculations. The rangekeeper's gears spun at maximum precision. Every sensor, every radar set, every mechanical calculator worked in perfect synchronization. The shells climbed. Milwaukee twisted. Mathematics met seamanship at 21 miles distance. And for the fourth time, the ocean around the destroyer exploded in geysers of white water. This time, one shell came within 20 yards. The explosion lifted Milwaukee's stern clear of the water for an instant, bending her propeller shafts, cracking her hull plating. Flooding began in the aft compartments, not catastrophic but enough to slow her down, enough to make her list slightly to starboard. But Milwaukee survived. Barely. Damaged, listing, with casualties on deck and flooding below, but still moving, still fighting, still alive. Commander Moriya had done what Captains Oda and Ishikawa couldn't. He'd escaped the Iowa-class battleships at the height of their power. At 0830, Admiral Spruance ordered the task group to break off pursuit. Iowa and New Jersey swung back toward the carrier task force, leaving Milwaukee to limp away at reduced speed, trailing oil and smoke. The American battleships had fired a total of 40 shells, 40 massive, expensive, technically sophisticated shells, at a single destroyer, and she'd escaped. Some on Iowa's crew saw it as failure. Lieutenant Kent, reviewing the fire control logs, felt frustrated that they hadn't achieved a kill despite remarkable accuracy. But Admiral Spruance saw it differently. "We just set a record," he told Captain McRae quietly. "Longest range straddle in naval history. 21.3 miles. Radar-controlled fire at a maneuvering target. 4 consecutive straddles. 5 years ago, this would have been science fiction. Today, it's just another morning's work." He paused, watching Milwaukee's smoke disappear over the horizon. That destroyer's captain is one lucky man. He's also about to file a report that will terrify every admiral in Tokyo. He's going to tell them that American battleships can hit targets they can't even see, from ranges where Japanese guns can't even reply. He's going to tell them that courage and seamanship aren't enough anymore. "That's worth 40 shells, Captain. That's worth not getting the kill." Spruance was right, though he couldn't have known how right. When Commander Moriya finally reached Yokosuka days later, his report sent shockwaves through the Imperial Navy's high command. The engagement off Truk became known as the battle where ghosts attacked, because Japanese officers couldn't accept that the Americans had fired from beyond the horizon, had tracked targets through radar, had turned gunnery into a mechanical process divorced from human eyesight or intuition. Naval doctrine officers pored over Moriya's report, trying to reconcile what he described with what they believed possible. Some accused him of exaggeration, of making excuses for the loss of Katori and Maikaze. Others simply refused to believe that American fire control could be that good, that precise, that overwhelmingly superior to Japan's optical systems. But a few officers, the younger ones, the ones who'd studied in America or Europe, who understood industrial engineering and electronic innovation, read Moriya's report and felt ice in their veins. They understood what it meant. They'd seen the writing on the wall for months, watching American production dwarf Japanese capacity, watching American technology advance while Japanese factories struggled to maintain output of existing designs. One young staff officer, reviewing damage reports from across the Pacific, wrote in his diary that night, "We trained men to be better warriors. They trained machines to be better calculators. We believed in the human spirit. They believed in the mathematics of death. Now we are paying the price for that faith." In the waters off Truk, the oil slick from Katori's sinking spread across nearly a square mile. Debris floated on the gentle swells, life jackets, wooden planks, personal effects from men who would never return home. Some survivors clung to wreckage, hoping for rescue that might never come. Others had already given up, letting the Pacific take them rather than face slow death from exposure or sharks. On one piece of floating deck plating, an ensign who'd survived the sinking clutched a waterlogged notebook. In it, he'd written his final observations before Katori went down, observations he hoped would somehow reach his family or his service if he didn't survive. "The Americans fired from beyond our vision, he'd scrawled in shaking handwriting. We never saw their ships clearly. Only masts on the horizon. Their shells fell with impossible accuracy. They knew exactly where we were, exactly how to hit us. Our guns couldn't even reach them. Our rangefinders couldn't see them. We died without ever having a chance to fight back. This is not war as we were taught. This is execution. The notebook would eventually wash up on truck, would be found by a Japanese search party, would make its way up the chain of command. Combined with Commander Moriya's detailed report and scattered accounts from other survivors, it would paint a picture of technological superiority so overwhelming that some Japanese admirals would refuse to believe it. But belief didn't matter. Reality had spoken with 16-inch guns at 21 miles range. Reality had rendered Japanese naval doctrine obsolete in the space of 30 minutes. Reality had proven that in modern war, the side that controlled information, that could see farther, calculate faster, and integrate data more precisely, would dominate the battlefield regardless of courage or tactical brilliance. The engagement off Truk on February 17, 1944, wasn't just a battle. It was a revelation. It marked the moment when electronic warfare came of age, when radar-guided gunnery proved its worth against real targets under combat conditions. It demonstrated that the Iowa-class battleships weren't just powerful ships, they were the physical embodiment of American industrial philosophy, where precision mattered more than size, where systems integration trumped raw capability, where mathematics defeated mythology. The sun climbed higher over the Pacific as Iowa and New Jersey rejoined the carrier task force. On their decks, sailors swabbed away soot and checked gun barrels for wear. The smell of cordite still hung in the air, mixing with salt spray and oil. In the plotting rooms, fire control officers logged the morning's engagement with clinical precision, rounds fired, ranges achieved, targets destroyed. It was just another data point in a war being won through mathematics. But in Tokyo, the data arriving from Truk was causing something close to panic. Vice Admiral Fukudome Shigeru, chief of the Navy General Staff's Operations Section, read Commander Moriya's preliminary report 3 times, hoping he'd misunderstood something. 21 miles. Radar-guided fire. 4 consecutive straddles. A target engaged successfully while completely beyond visual range. Each sentence contradicted decades of Japanese naval doctrine. This cannot be accurate, Fukudome told his staff officers, gathered in the underground command center beneath the Naval Ministry. No ship can fire accurately at such ranges. The curvature of the Earth alone, sir, a younger officer interrupted carefully, we have corroborating reports. From survivors of the cruiser Agano, sunk 2 days earlier. From the destroyer Oit. From multiple sources across the Central Pacific. The Americans have developed fire control systems far in advance of our own. Their radar integration allows, I know what radar is, Commander, Fukudome snapped. We have radar. We've installed it on our major units. But radar for ranging, for detection, not for fire control. Not for computing ballistic solutions while both ships are maneuvering at high speed over distances of, he checked the report again. 35,700 yards. He set the paper down, suddenly feeling very old. Around him, staff officers waited in uncomfortable silence. They all understood what this meant, even if they couldn't say it aloud. Japan's naval superiority, the foundation of its Pacific strategy, had been built on superior training, superior tactics, and superior night fighting capability. But the Americans had rendered all of that irrelevant with machines that thought faster than humans, that saw through darkness and distance, that reduced naval combat to a mathematical equation. What are our options? Fukudome asked finally. The silence stretched longer. Then a senior gunnery officer spoke. We can improve our radar sets. We can attempt to integrate fire control computers similar to the American systems. But sir, this requires industrial capacity we no longer possess. The Americans can manufacture these systems by the hundreds. Our factories are being bombed daily. Our electrical industry cannot produce the vacuum tubes, the precision components, how long? Fukudome interrupted. If we committed fully to developing comparable systems, how long? 2 years. Minimum. And that assumes no disruption to our industrial base, which is optimistic given the bombing campaign. 2 years. Fukudome did the math in his head. In 2 years, at the current rate of loss, Japan wouldn't have a navy left to equip with improved fire control systems. The Americans were building ships faster than Japan could sink them, not that Japan was sinking many ships anymore. The balance had shifted so dramatically that Japanese submarines now avoided American convoys, and Japanese surface forces sortied only when absolutely necessary, knowing each engagement risked ships that couldn't be replaced. "What about our battleships?" another officer asked. "The Yamato, the Musashi. Their 18-inch guns outrange anything the Americans possess. If we could bring them to bear, range means nothing without accuracy," Fukudome said quietly. "The Yamato's guns can throw a shell 27 miles. But without radar fire control, without electronic ranging, she's firing blind at anything beyond 15 miles. The Americans can hit targets at 21 miles with confidence. Do you understand what that means? It means Yamato could be engaged and destroyed without ever being able to return effective fire." The room fell silent again. The Yamato-class battleships were Japan's pride, the ultimate expression of naval power, the ships that were supposed to guarantee victory in the decisive battle that naval doctrine had promised for decades. To admit they were obsolete, outmatched by smaller American ships with superior electronics, was to admit that Japan's entire naval strategy had been based on false assumptions. But facts didn't care about pride. The numbers were stark and undeniable. At Truk, American forces had destroyed 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, 3 auxiliary cruisers, 2 submarine tenders, and 32 merchant ships in 2 days. They'd done it with radar-guided attacks, with precision bombing, with fire control systems that turned night into day and distance into irrelevance. And they'd done it with minimal losses, 1 carrier slightly damaged, a few dozen aircraft lost. Meanwhile, Japan's losses were accelerating. Every convoy sunk meant less fuel for the combined fleet. Every trained pilot lost meant the next generation would be less skilled. Every month of bombing reduced Japan's industrial capacity further, widening the technological gap. It was a death spiral, and everyone in that room knew it. "There's something else," a junior intelligence officer said hesitantly. "The Americans are producing Iowa-class battleships at a rate of approximately 1 per year. We've confirmed 4 are now operational: Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin. 2 more, Illinois and Kentucky, are under construction. By contrast, we completed our last battleship, Musashi, in 1942. We have no more battleships under construction. None planned. The shipyards that built Yamato and Musashi are now producing destroyers and escorts because we desperately need convoy protection." He paused, letting that sink in. "Gentlemen, in another year, the Americans will have 6 Iowa-class battleships, possibly more. Each one can engage targets beyond the range of our most powerful ships. Each one has radar fire control that makes our optical systems obsolete. Each one can steam at 33 knots, faster than any Japanese battleship. What doctrine do we employ against such a force?" No one answered. There was no answer. Japanese naval doctrine had been built around the concept of decisive battle, the idea that through superior training and tactical brilliance, a smaller Japanese fleet could destroy a larger enemy fleet in a climactic engagement. But decisive battle required the enemy to accept engagement at ranges where Japanese guns could be effective, where Japanese torpedoes could reach their targets, where Japanese training could make the difference. The Iowa-class battleships had made decisive battle impossible. They could engage from beyond reply, could track targets through weather and darkness, could deliver devastating firepower with mechanical precision. Against such ships, courage was irrelevant. Training was meaningless. The only thing that mattered was industrial capacity and technological sophistication, and in both categories, America had surpassed Japan so completely that the gap was unbridgeable.
Admiral Toyota Somu, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, absorbed these reports in his flagship's operations room with the stoic calm of a man who'd long since accepted the inevitable. He'd known since Midway that Japan was losing the war. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had confirmed it, with American carrier aircraft slaughtering Japanese pilots in what the Americans mockingly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Now Truk had proven something even more devastating, that Japan's surface fleet was obsolete, outclassed by ships that represented an entirely different philosophy of warfare. Convey to all fleet commanders, Toyota ordered quietly, that surface engagements with American Iowa-class battleships are to be avoided unless absolutely necessary. These ships possess fire control capabilities that render conventional surface combat doctrine ineffective. Evasion and retreat are not dishonorable when facing an enemy that can destroy you from beyond your ability to retaliate. His staff officers exchanged glances. This was unprecedented, a formal acknowledgement that Japanese ships should avoid combat, that there were enemy vessels against which traditional Bushido principles didn't apply. But no one objected. They'd all read the reports. They understood. Toyota continued, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret or might have been resignation. Inform all commanders that our strategy must shift entirely to aircraft and submarine operations. Surface forces will be preserved for final decisive operations only. Until then, we conserve our strength. It was a bitter pill, made more bitter by the knowledge that even this conservative strategy wouldn't save them. American submarines were already strangling Japanese merchant shipping. American aircraft controlled the skies. And now American surface forces had proven they could engage and destroy Japanese ships with impunity, using technology that Japan couldn't match and couldn't counter. In the weeks following Truk, Japanese naval communications were filled with accounts of American technological superiority. Radar that could detect aircraft at 100 miles. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells that exploded near targets without direct hits. Fire control computers that could track dozens of targets simultaneously. Each report added to the growing understanding that this war had become unwinnable, that Japan was fighting an enemy whose industrial and technological base was simply too advanced to overcome through courage or determination. Some officers refused to accept it. They insisted that Bushido spirit could still prevail, that one climactic battle could turn the tide, that Japanese warriors were inherently superior to American technicians. These officers would lead the kamikaze attacks later in the war, sacrificing thousands of pilots in desperate attempts to sink American carriers through sheer force of will. But the more realistic officers understood that the war was lost. They began planning for how to extract the best possible surrender terms, how to preserve what remained of Japanese military honor, how to ensure that Japan would survive as a nation even in defeat. For them, the engagement off Truk was the moment when illusions died and reality became inescapable. Across the Pacific, in Pearl Harbor, American analysts studied the Truk engagement from a very different perspective. For them, it was validation of years of research and development, proof that the enormous investment in radar and fire control technology had been worthwhile. Commander William Sims, a fire control specialist studying the engagement data, wrote in his official report, "The action off Truk demonstrates conclusively that radar-directed naval gunfire has fundamentally altered the nature of surface combat." The Iowa-class battleships achieved firing solutions of unprecedented accuracy at ranges that would have been considered impossible using optical methods alone. This represents not merely an incremental improvement in existing technology, but a qualitative leap that renders traditional naval doctrine obsolete. He continued, "It should be noted that Japanese forces in this engagement displayed considerable skill and courage. Commander Moriya's handling of the destroyer Nowaki was exemplary by any standard. He survived through superior seamanship and aggressive maneuvering. However, his survival should not obscure the central fact: American forces engaged and destroyed 2 Japanese warships while suffering no damage themselves, at ranges where the enemy could not effectively return fire. This is the future of naval warfare." Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, read Sims's report with satisfaction. The Navy's gamble on radar and advanced fire control had paid off spectacularly.
The Iowa-class battleships had proven themselves to be exactly what their designers intended: fast, powerful, and technologically superior platforms that could dominate any surface engagement. But Nimitz also understood something that would only become clear in hindsight: this was the end of an era. The Iowa-class battleships represented the absolute peak of battleship design, the culmination of centuries of naval architecture and gunnery development. They were perfect machines for a type of warfare that was already becoming obsolete. The future belonged to aircraft carriers, to submarines, to guided missiles. The future would be decided by who controlled the air and who could strike from beyond the horizon with weapons that didn't require massive ships and crews of thousands. The Iowa-class battleships would serve with distinction for decades, providing shore bombardment in Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf. But they would never again face enemy battleships in surface combat. The engagement off Truk on February 17, 1944, was both a triumph and a swan song, proof of American technological superiority and the last gasp of traditional naval warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.